Okay, in case there's somebody on the session who's not familiar with myself or the Transparency Task Force, I will very briefly explain that the TTF is pretty unique, in my opinion. It's unique because we are an international community of individuals in and connected to the financial services industry who are very keen, but it changes. We want it to be more transparent, more truthful, more trustworthy. We're doing many, many things to try to make a positive difference. And quite frankly, we're proud of the amount of work and activity going in to try to make the world a better place through the financial system. We're doing a hell of a lot with very, very little. We're clearly not perfect. We do some things really well, some things we're not so good at, but we're always trying and we're always trying to improve. We're always open to suggestions in terms of how we can go about doing what we're doing better. So please don't hold back with any constructive criticism you may have about myself or the yeah. The kind of overarching theme for tonight's session, of course, you know the title. The title is, Are the Financial Regulators Fit for Purpose? The overarching theme is a phrase, and the phrase is, progress begins with realism. And it's an important phrase because what that phrase helps us to do is understand why we at the Transparency Task Force are very, very keen to facilitate candid yet constructive criticism opportunities about our regulatory framework. This is important. It is important that we facilitate the kind of conversations where people can say it as they see it. And so long as we're being civil and constructive, I really don't mind how critical people are about anything, be that about the regulators or frankly anything else. We try to be collaborative, collegiate, civilized in our approach, but tonight definitely is an opportunity for people to share what they really think. Please just do it in a polite and civilized and courteous manner. Play the ball, not the man, so to speak. So recognize that the issues we're discovering and exploring this evening are really about systems and structure and incentives and human nature. And whilst there may well be particular individuals that you are particularly concerned about, please do try to, as it were, play the ball, not the man, the issue, not the person behind the issue. And that's important. I got into this kind of way of thinking in my 20s. In my 20s, on 3 separate occasions, I had good reason to alert companies I was working for about things that were going on in those companies that I knew was wrong. Unfortunately for me at the time, the companies I was working for didn't really take what I was saying seriously and thought I was the problem for having an issue with what was going on. And the net result is I ended up losing my job on 3 occasions, which was a very painful experience, twice out of those 3 times, because I had a wife with young children and I really didn't have another good job to go to, etc. And the reason I'm saying this is because for many, many, many years, I was extremely bitter and angry at the individuals involved with what's going on. But as time went by, I started to see things more in terms of the structure and the systems that were causing the behavior that was taking place. And to cut a very long story short, that's why on the 6th of May 2015, when I had the opportunity to do so, I delivered a speech at Senate House, London University, all about the need for radical reform of the financial system and all about the power of transparency to drive the kind of change that we all want to see. Enough about me. I'm going to pass over to Alexandra in a moment, who's going to deal with a couple of housekeeping points, and then we're going to go straight to Mark Bishop, who'll be speaking, including his Q&A session, for no more than 30 minutes, because we really do need to manage time very, very effectively today, especially as we have such a large audience here. So Alexandra, over to you, please. Thank you.
Hi, evening everyone. I'm Alexandra, I'm the head of events at TTF. Just to let you know, we are recording this event and we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel in due course. So if there's anything you regret saying in hindsight or something you just don't want us to include, please let me know. I'll put my email address in the little chat. And speaking of the chat, obviously, because we're such a big group, we won't have time to do introductions. So please put your contact details, your name, any social media handles, or any comments you want to make in the chat, and I'll circulate all the notes tomorrow. And also with social media, if you could, and if you want to, please do tweet as much as you can during the event. I'll put our Twitter handle and any hashtags in the chat. I think that's it. Perfect.
That's absolutely perfect. Thank you very much, Alexandra. We have a small team at the TTF, but every one of the team is really committed to what we're doing, and I'm very grateful for Alexandra's input to helping these events to be successful. Okay, I mentioned earlier that the overarching theme is progress begins with realism. Believe you me, it's really tempting to not tell it as it is. Life's easier. My life would be a lot easier if we weren't doing what we're doing right now. But I think that ultimately it is better for every individual and every organization if we are able to operate within a culture of truthfulness and transparency. And that means saying it as it is. That means recognizing that progress begins with realism. We'll only really make the regulatory reforms that are necessary if we have a really good understanding of the reality of the situation. And that is why tonight's event is so important. We really do want to get a grip on what people really think about the current regulatory framework, not just in the UK, but internationally as well. There's good reason to think that some of the issues in the UK are not that different to some of the issues in the USA, in Australia, in Canada, and many other countries around the world. Our first speaker is Mark Bishop. As I said, Mark's going to be speaking in total for 30 minutes, including his Q&A. I've got to know Mark, I think, reasonably well over the last 6 months. He's remarkably thoughtful about the issues we're going to be discussing this evening. I think you're going to find his session to be highly informative. It's full of ideas and solutions, and frankly, his tremendous frustration in having the Financial Conduct Authority not being willing to listen to the very good ideas that he has to offer. That will be one of the things that comes through this evening. Mark's been profoundly helpful to the TTF over the last few months. For example, he's been particularly helpful in relation to some very good consultation responses we've put in. And in fact, Mark is currently working on 2. We are actively looking for more volunteers to join the consultation groups, but I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Mr. Mark Bishop, over to you, and looking forward to your session. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed, Andy. I'm now going to go to our share screen. Can you see a presentation pretty much full screen?
Yes, we can. It's coming through. Perfect.
Okay, that's fine. So many of you have read Raj Parker's independent review of the FCA's handling of the regulation of the Connaught Income Fund Series 1. If you haven't, you've probably read some of the media coverage about it. Really, I'm here to give you the alternative version, which comes from the perspective of somebody who works on the Action Group and the Liquidators Committee. So kind of compare this to the official version and maybe form your own view as to which is probably the more accurate. The first is, what was the fund? A little kind of introduction to it. It was UK-based UCIS, specialised in bridging loans over a short duration, 6 months maximum, high quality borrowers, modest LTV, and capital secured on property and guaranteed by a third party, around 8% yield, which could be accrued or paid out. It was launched in April 2008 and suspended March 2012. In reality, it was a bad faith lending fraud. Money was used for many unauthorised purposes. The key protagonists had what's best called as interesting backstories. Key firms lacked strong balance sheets or professional indemnity cover. The FSA knew all of this but didn't act. It ignored 4 whistleblowers, and interestingly, records of 3 of them have simply disappeared. It also ignored many very obvious signs of trouble over a long period of time. The independent review is relatively independent. It was commissioned by the FCA, not the Treasury, and they set the terms of reference, chose the reviewer, and set the protocols, found that regulation was neither appropriate nor effective. How much money was lost? This is obviously important to those of us who are affected. Well, there are two versions of events. If you read Raj Parker's review, he says that fund investors recouped a considerable proportion of their investment, meaning their principal. So not all of their principal, and they may have had other losses other than the sum of the principal. The FCA says the intention of the FCA deal with Capita that was done in 2017, paid out 2018, was to place all investors as closely as possible back in the position they would have been in if they had never invested in the fund. So the FCA wants us to believe that we were made whole. Now, is that true? Here's a reconciliation. The first is capital. The Liquidators report says that when they were appointed, £104 million was owed to the investors. It is a matter of fact that we had about £80 million back by the end of 2018. The FCA says that this means we've been repaid in full, because actually you can take £25 million off the initial capital sum because of income accrued or paid out during the fund's life. No fund manager would be allowed to take money that was taxed and described as income and call it returns of capital. So why should they be allowed to get away with the same thing? Next is contractual interest. Under insolvency law, interest continues to accrue even after the appointment of insolvency practitioners. And of course, if we hadn't invested in this scheme, we would have invested our money elsewhere. We would have got a sensible return. The FTSE 100 gives a return of around 8% long run average and is highly liquid. This was highly illiquid, and we would expect a higher return than that, the contractual interest rate being just above 8%. Well, the FCA says within our £8 million, there is interest at 0.52% per year, and that's all we can expect. So it wants us to believe that sophisticated, professional, high net worth investors advised by IFAs would voluntarily have tied up their capital for almost a decade for near zero returns on the principal. Okay, so next one is consequential losses, opportunity and time costs. In civil litigation, you would say that these are costs that can be recharged to the causative agent. We don't know what they are because nobody has gone round the investors, 2,000 of them, and asked them this question, but it must be substantial. FCA is just ignoring this category of loss. So in total, you have at least £170 million plus whatever the consequential losses, etc., are as money out. Money in, you've got 80 million, and therefore you've got a loss of probably realistically north of £100 million. So it's pretty substantial. How do you stop it happening again? That's probably the most important thing, really. So the first thing is, I think that you should look at what the independent review says. It says that the FCA needs to be clearer about the regulatory perimeter and the role of operators and authorised corporate directors. It should improve interdepartmental information sharing and IT systems. There should be better coordination between teams. It should improve whistleblowing systems, and it should address its culture, which is too cautious. I'm sure all of that's true, but I don't think it's the full story. Firstly, was the regulator really just negligent? Imagine you could create the world's worst incompetent regulator. It would make every decision on the flick of a coin. It would look not at all at the evidence or the law. A coin comes up heads half the time. So half the time you would actually act to protect consumers. In the Connaught case, you can read the report, 8 years, not once did they do that. So you've got to say, is it possible that it was merely negligent? What about the underlying causes? What about these cultural factors? What about governance? Can the FCA be trusted to mark or correct its own homework? Well, my recommendations are, firstly, the FCA should compensate the victims in full. Clearly, I have a horse in this race, but actually there's a reason why it matters, and that is you can't be seen to reform unless you first accepted liability for what you've done wrong. Also, if you expect other people who are victims of regulatory failure to spend many years trying to unearth the truth, you should have some carrot that says that maybe at the end of it, if you prove right, you will be repaid by the regulator. If people like me are left hanging, will that happen? Second, by all means implement the independent review recommendations. They are good, they just don't go far enough. Where we need to go, I think, is genuine cultural and operational transformation. I've got a few slides that recommend some ideas there. And finally, you've got to fix the governance so things don't drift back again. So the next few slides I'm going to show you are just excerpts from a presentation that I put together for the FCA in 2014 2014, so more than 6 years ago, with some ideas about how to fix the underlying problems, as I see them, of the FCA, based not only on Connaught, but on other cases. You may or may not agree with these things, be interested in your views. So I'm only showing you a few of them. Some of the examples I've given are more recent, but I swear to you that the recommendations are all from 2014. So the first one is, I believe that the voice of the customer should be heard more loudly and more often in the FCA's head office. And the customer, of course, here means users of financial services. You can segment them as well. You know, in the pyramid, there's a lot of people at the bottom who've got no complaints about financial services or how it's regulated. Then you've got people in the middle who've complained, but they've been satisfied by how the regulators treated them. And at the top, those who've complained have been dissatisfied. So those people at the bottom are very useful for research and crowdsourcing of what people's views are on their behaviour. You can get online and phone reporting from them. You can also give them advice and warnings. The people in the middle, those are the people that you should kind of give key account management to. They can also be useful for empathy briefings. What I mean by that is you can take victims of financial services misconduct and bring them in to an induction presentation with new members of staff and have the victims explain what it feels like to have all of your money taken away, to be otherwise mistreated, to have your business destroyed by a bank. You know, that is the way of getting the staff of the FCA to understand what it feels like and to motivate them to help consumers. You could even go further and set up a buddy system whereby every new employee, or even every existing employee, has somebody out there in the community of people who've been affected by misconduct in the financial service industry that they work with on an ongoing basis. And the people at the top, of course, who've got a problem with how the FCA has been working for them should have regular access to the senior team and also should be invited in for change briefings like this to discuss how the thing might be improved. Now, here is an example of what happens when these things don't take place. In the Woodford case, I'm sure many of you read that the Guernsey Stock Exchange tried to contact the FCA to tip it off about Woodford trying to list some of its unlisted stocks so it could get around the rules of the fund. And it tried to make contact several times in April of 2019 and only got a call back on the 8th of May. Now, if that's a regulator and a Crown dependency, imagine what happens if you're a consumer or an individual whistleblower. The next thing is going the other way. Just as the FCA should be closer to the public, it should be a little bit further away from the industry. Here is an example. The FCA Careers Twitter account says that all of their graduate trainees go on external secondment to gain industry experience. Is that really the right thing to do? It kind of makes them empathise with people from the industry from the get-go. And it'll be large firms as well, not some IFA firm in the sticks. Here's an interesting job ad from the FCA. There are few jobs where you can make a real difference to the 2 million people who work in the UK financial services industry. That is not the statutory purpose of the FCA. It's not some kind of welfare union for the financial services industry. And the problem is, although the FCA tells me this ad no longer runs, this was for senior people. So a load of people at the top of the organisation or near it were brought in thinking that this is what they were supposed to do. And perhaps more seriously, the people who are interviewing them and who are advertising this job clearly had no problem with this ad. So they think it's what they're supposed to be hiring as well. And here's another example of how these things can go wrong. You might all remember a year or two ago, the story came out that Simone Ferreira of the FCA, who was overseeing the GRG Section 166 review, was socialising, found to be socialising at a karaoke bar with senior figures from RBS while the investigation was ongoing. Isn't that embarrassing? And for me, the problem is not so much that there wasn't a rule to prevent this, but actually if the culture of the organisation were how it should be, she wouldn't have wanted to socialise with these people. She would have been empathising with the victims and thinking, actually, those people at RBS, they're not the best people. I don't want to spend my time with them. The next thing is the revolving door. I think there are far too many revolving door appointments and secondments. And there's a great tweet here from Clive May, who talks about somebody who was seconded from RBS into the FCA, who'd been working on the RBS GRG section, working in GRG at the time of the Section 166 review. You know, this kind of thing is not appropriate and it shouldn't happen. Next thing is a real bugbear of mine, diversity. The FCA parrots, you know, how much of a diverse employer it is. There's always a rainbow when it comes to, you know, the right times of the year when people are celebrating various types of diversity. But I actually think it's one of the least diverse organisations I've ever dealt with. And this letter explains it really well. It's from, I think, from the Sunday Times a couple of years ago. I'll read you a little bit from the third leg of it. A board made up of corporate lawyers would not have much diversity, even if half were female and a tenth from ethnic minorities. A board of 10 white men who think differently would be diverse. And in the final leg, it says, real diversity means diversity of thought, attitudes, values, behaviour. That is what leads to change, to sparks, to improved ways of working. I think in the FCA, there are a hell of a lot of young graduates from Russell Group universities who have mostly law degrees, and they all live in London. So they will tend to have certain attitudes and values in common. They will probably socialise with a lot of other lawyers, many of them in magic circle firms or in the supervision or rather the compliance departments of banks and other large financial institutions. Here's an interesting quote, again from our friends at the FCA Careers Department. There aren't many jobs where you have the opportunity to question CEOs of banks at the age of 22, says Sean, graduate. Personally, I think there might be a reason for that, don't you? I think the problem here is not just that it happens, but the Careers Department doesn't understand why it's a problem. So here is my poster boy for the new type of diversity the FCA needs, in my humble opinion. It is Detective Inspector Gene Hunt from Ashes to Ashes, far up the Quattro Bolly. Now, why is he diverse? He's over 40, he's not a graduate, he's certainly not a lawyer, actually quite dislikes slick lawyers, city bankers in their expensive suits. But really, above all else, he has an absolute determination to get up at Sparrows in order that he can be at the door, kicking down a door at dawn, so he can arrest bad guys, so that little old ladies can sleep soundly in their beds at night. I have never met people who have that kind of urgency or determination to them in the FCA. And I'm not saying that the FCA should literally just hire a load of middle-aged white men who are detectives. I'm not suggesting that at all. There are other professions where people have these types of attitudes. Investigative journalists, spooks, for example, people who investigate tax fraud or benefits fraud at the HMRC. So let's try and get some diversity of background into the FCA, people who have skills and attitudes that are not commonly found there. Transparency and accountability. Well, I'm at a TTF event, so why shouldn't I talk about transparency? Here is a case of why the FCA gets things wrong because it's not transparent. Many of you know that in the Woodford case, the authorised corporate director Link has been heavily criticised for the way in which it conducted its business. Link used to be Capita Financial Managers Limited, and they were the people who ran both Arch Crew and Connaught. Both of those scandals involved misconduct and large amounts of money lost by consumers. In both of the cases, what was Capita and is now Link, avoided all enforcement action, as did its senior team, simply by paying a small proportion of the consumers' losses. Now, if there was more scrutiny of the FCA, it would be held accountable for these sorts of decisions, and I suspect it would act differently in the future, and firms like this would no longer be in the marketplace in a position to harm consumer interests. Okay, so underuse of statutory powers, that's something else we often see, isn't it? Here is a great quote from our good friend Andrew Bailey when he was running the FCA. He told the Treasury Select Committee, "We don't publish Section 166 reports, and I have to be concerned at the effect that publishing one would have on the process of others. I don't want firms saying, I'm not going to cooperate with you because I know you're going to publish this at the end of the day." Now, Section 166 is Section 166 of the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000. It is literally an act of Parliament in the UK. It's the law. There's nothing optional about cooperating with it. And for the Chief Executive of the FCA to be making a public statement that suggests otherwise, in my view, undermines the authority of the regulator and the writ of the law. Pay, reward and evaluation internal. This is an interesting point that Andy made, which is we shouldn't be too critical of individuals, we should be critical of the system. But this is one area where actually the two start to collide, because the individuals that are employed by the FCA are the result of the system. And my own experience of the FCA is that not all of them are of the standard that I would like them to be. So I think one thing the FCA could do is perhaps bring in external HR consultants and put all of its staff through an evaluation tool, which I'm going to show you. It's very simple, 2 axes. One of them across the bottom is how focused are they on protecting consumers and consumers' interests. And the other one across the top, upright, is how good is their performance? You could then create a 2x2 box out of this. You can tell I've got an MBA and done a bit of consultancy work along the way. And bottom left, you have people who are not interested in helping consumers and are not high performance. Frankly, they're village idiots. Bottom right, you've got people who really want to help consumers, but they're not doing a great job. I call them the well-meant. Top left, you've got people who are very high performance, but not trying to help consumers. I call them the captured. And top right, you have people who are high performers because they are really good at their job and they are very much trying to help consumers. Now, one of the things I would ask as a rhetorical question, perhaps we'll discuss it in the comments later, is how many people in the FCA sit in each of these boxes? I haven't met very many high performers, frankly, and I would be very much supportive of a process that changed that. And the process, unfortunately, looks a bit like this. What do you do with the village idiots? Well, frankly, you outplace them. They're not on our side, get rid of them. What about the well-meant? Well, you may well be able to upskill a lot of them. Some of them you may be able to demote. They may be good at a certain level of job, but not at other levels of job. If that doesn't work, outplace them. What about the captured? Well, some of those captured people came in because of job ads like the one I showed you that said your job is to look after the interests of the financial services industry. You may be able to reorient those people, just simply explain to them what the job really is and create an empathy and association with victims of misconduct and consumers generally. Some of them you won't. You know, there are some I've met, frankly, come across as high-functioning sociopaths. They are there to do what the industry wants and then get a thank you job in the industry. I think you just got to remove them. You've got to be fairly brutal about it because otherwise they will be your enemies. They'll try and stop you from changing the organisation. And as for the high performers, well, it's obvious what you do with those people. You promote them. You almost over-promote them. You give those people huge amounts of responsibility. You trust them and you empower them. They are the future of the organisation. They do exist. They do exist in the FCA. I have met some of them. Next thing is a question about enforcement. Very often enforcement actions, particularly with large firms, focus on fining the shareholders. You know, the shareholders of a bank are not responsible for bank's misconduct. They had no ability to stop it. They didn't know it was happening at the time. They can't even sack the perpetrators. And yet they usually pick up the bill, firstly for compensating the victims, and secondly for the fines that regulators issue against them. I won't read you this quote, but it's from Georgina Filippo. Basically what she thinks is that firms can be responsible for misconduct. It's not possible. It's human beings that drive the action of firms. Now, whistleblowers. I know there are some whistleblowers on the call today. August people, they are. You have seen the Freedom of Information request a couple of years ago that the FCA spends more on its chief executive's pay and benefits than on helping whistleblowers, in fact, on running the entire whistleblowing department. Clearly, that money may need to go up, but it's not about the money alone, in my view. It's also about who works in that department. And an idea I have is employ a load of whistleblowers there. You know, we know them, the names of them, some of them on this call. If those people really understand what it's like to be a whistleblower, and they will be motivated to do the right thing. Next is the non-executives, key part of the governance. Two of them were appointed by the business department and are supposed to be on the side of consumers. Not so long ago, a load of consumers were protesting outside the FCA's offices, and Richard Lloyd, one of those two supposedly pro-consumer non-execs, actually criticised them. Few, if any, CEOs join a protest outside their office and invite protesters in for tea, as Andrew Bailey did today. I hope people who routinely aim personal abuse at one of the most thoughtful, straight and honourable regulators I've known will think again. To which I replied, Richard is an independent non-exec appointed to the FCA board to represent consumer interests. He got the job after writing the whitewash report, largely exonerating the ombudsman of the Channel 4 dispatches allegations. He is the Shami Chakrabarti of financial services regulation. Now, you may think I'm unfair and I'm targeting an individual there, but actually it's about the systemic thing. Why is it that essentially business interests get to appoint the pro-consumer non-execs? Then you've got the Financial Services Consumer Panel. In law, a key part of the governance of the FCA, there is a comply or explain regime in place. But actually, if you look at the Consumer Panel website, which is hosted, I believe, by the FCA, it says that the appointments to this committee are often based on nominations made by trade associations. And one year I got an interview for this and I was told I couldn't join because I might criticise the FCA. Well, that's the idea. It's supposed to be a constructive critic. And that year, two people joined. One was Mark Chidley, who used to be head of the in-house legal team at RBS when Fred the Shred was in full pomp. And the other one, Kitty Usher, used to be a city minister when the kind of minimal regulation era was at its high point, and she left the world of politics because she was one of the people done for flipping her main home designation in 2010. So these slides really summarise some of the criticisms and proposals for change that I've made to the FCA. I won't go through in huge detail this slide, but it's really a history of my attempts to encourage the FCA to consider some of these ideas. Back in 2012, fund was suspended. By the autumn of that year, we, the action group, worked out what had gone wrong, and we asked the FCA for a review because we could see that there were regulatory failures. They refused. From 2014, I had produced this presentation, and I have offered to present it to every chief executive, permanent or interim, that there has been of the FCA since. Every single one of them has refused. 2 of them have allowed me to present it to direct reports. First time that happened in 2015, the guy said, "Thank you for this, but we can't see any need to change, we're perfect." Second time it happened, end of 2016, the guy said, "Well, Andrew Bailey has started a mission review which will fix the FCA. Just send it into that. The FCA will be fixed, you don't need to worry." Andrew, Andrew Bailey went. Nikhil Ratti is now there. He has refused to see these slides. And he's been saying to the Treasury Committee and to the annual public meeting that he is absolutely committed to improve diversity of thinking. So I said, why don't you just look at 6 slides about that? No, not interested in that either. But what he has done is to appoint a new person, or to create a new role of Executive Director for Transformation. And the person who's appointed to this role is Megan Butler. Now, again, we don't want to criticise an individual, but I will say that if you read Dame Elizabeth Gloucester's report into the LCF scandal, it criticises Megan and her team extensively. If Raj Parker's Connaught review had named individuals, it would have criticised her extensively. You've got to ask, how serious is Nikhil Ratti about reform if he's hiring somebody who is such a key part of the problem to lead the change programme? So I think what this highlights is that actually we need, if we're going to solve the problems that the FCA has, we need to change its governance. We've got to tackle regulatory capture. FCA won't undertake genuine reform unless it's forced to do so. The board is appointed by the Treasury and the Business Department, the Consumer Panel by the FCA on industry advice. They represent producer, not consumer interests, and they're not going to force the issue. So a new oversight body is needed to set the change agenda, ensure it's achieved, and provide genuine ongoing scrutiny. It must be established on a statutory basis and have genuine power over the FCA. Its composition must reflect consumer interests. So I propose we create an organisation, or the organisation is created, called the Financial Regulators Supervisory Council, very much based on ideas from Andy Shmulo in the last of these, previous of these presentations or seminars. The key powers and responsibilities would be hiring and firing and reviewing, jointly with the Treasury, the FCA's chair and chief executive. Currently the Treasury does this. And on its own, 2 FCA non-executives, currently appointed by the Business Department, members and chair of the Financial Services Consumer Panel, the Financial Regulators Complaints Commissioner, and the FRSE's own chief executive and employees, can commission periodic reviews of FCA effectiveness and independent reviews into alleged regulatory failures. One of the problems at the moment is that it's the HMT and the FCA that commission these things. It could set the rules for the complaint scheme covering the FCA, which, as we know, it's trying to kind of keep changing to be more beneficial to itself and make it no longer having to pay out any compensation. It could publish white papers and consultation responses and annual reviews of the regulatory environment. To ensure its independent, all roles should be openly advertised. There should be 4 initial members appointed by, and I'm going to suggest here, Transparency Task Force, Whistleblowers UK, the Connaught Creditors Committee and the LCF Creditors Committee, simply because those are people who've done the hard yards and they're on the side of consumers. Initial members would select 3 more members. After year 4, 1 member retires each year by drawing of lots. Subsequent members serve 4-year terms. Replacement members selected by the existing members following open ad campaigns, and members therefore represent consumer interests in perpetuity. There will be rigorous contractual clauses to prevent revolving door incentivization of these people. How would you fund it? You'd fund it by top slicing 0.5% off the FCA's income, so 3.2 million a year. This would ensure that we would get proper value from the remaining 99.5%. Benefits would be genuine counterbalance to regulatory capture, a permanent solution, not a quick fix, but it's the start of a journey, not the end. So what are the next steps? Well, if we think this is a good idea, we can include it in our response to the Treasury's Future Regulatory Framework Consultation Part 2. We should also, I think, propose a Royal or Truth and Reconciliation Commission that would discuss redress for legacy cases and help the bad guys to leave the industry and the regulator. I also think it's critical that there should be an actionable duty of care of regulated authorised firms to consumers and of the FCA to both. So that is my presentation. We have only a very short amount of time left. I apologise for questions and comments. Andy, do you want to fire away?
Thank you, Mark. Before I do anything else, I think it's wholly appropriate that we all show our appreciation for the time and effort and life experience that went into the session we've just seen. Let's do that, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Absolutely superb. Very, 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 very well done. I can just begin to imagine the amount of frustration and having those thoughts and ideas and insights and experience and not being able to share them with the very entity you're actually trying to help. You're actually trying to help. Okay, we're going to go to Q&A. So please just wave a hand if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. Please just literally wave your hand so I can see you easily. We've got quite a few people on the session tonight. Who'd like to kick things off with a comment at this point in time? Pauline Creasy, lovely to see you with us, Pauline. Please take yourself off mute, Pauline. Because we don't have time for everybody to introduce themselves, if you are going to be asking a question or making a point, please briefly introduce yourself so everybody knows who you are. In this case, Pauline Creasy, tell us a bit about yourself and go straight to your point. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Brilliant, Mark. Thank you very much. I'm the chair of the Premier FX Liquidation Committee. Our fraud was discovered in July 2018, so I'm a bit behind you in terms of trying to force the regulator and the bank involved to pay back our money if we can. I also am a business owner. Mark, I would really like to ask you a couple of things, very specific things if I may. I thought your presentation was great and I've got great sympathy with it. My committee has spent the last 2 years trying to understand, financial services regulations, and it's been absolutely shocking what we've learnt about the FCA failings just on our case, because we were not an investment fund. I think I've explained to you before, we were just payment service users. And because the FCA has now admitted that they were not actually monitoring anything that this payment service company did for 8 years, okay, and kept reauthorizing them without doing any checks on what was going through the banks. Turned out they were doing huge money laundering. The thing went pear-shaped, it was a Ponzi scam. And so lots of people's transactions, as I said, we were not investors, our money was just in play, remittances got stolen when it crashed after a spectacular bad FX deal. It was an FX firm as well as money remittance. What did I want to ask you? What was Megan Butler responsible for regarding your case, the Connaught, first of all? Because she's been most recently responsible for wholesale authorizations. And we've had conversations with her and also her counterpart, Jonathan Davidson, who's also been removed, as you probably know, because he was handling the retail side, which covered our case. And then I just wanted to quickly ask you about your views about negligence. You were saying if you can prove negligence, you think, sorry, I might have misunderstood you, but I thought you said if you could prove negligence and it comes down to negligence and you've got a strong case for it, then the FCA are going to be forced to do something. I'm just very interested in your comments about that, because when we have raised this with the FCA, they immediately trot out their mission statement, which has been supplied to them by the Treasury, which they claim has been approved by Parliament, and which says that they can't actually be accused of negligence unless it's proven in a court that they did it, set out to do it deliberately, or that it's violated some of your key human rights.
Okay, so I wonder if I could just answer those 2 points. The first one is Megan Butler. I'm going to be careful what I say because she isn't named in the Connaught report and she isn't here to defend herself. But what I'll say is that, it's a matter of public record what roles she has performed. She's been involved in wholesale, authorizations, but also in supervision, and it's probably more in the supervision role that she's criticised in the LCF report. But before that, she actually briefly was at the Bank of England, but she went there from the FSA, and she was very much at the FSA in the Connaught era, and particularly she played a significant role in the enforcement division. And there are some criticisms of the Enforcement Division and of the ERIC committee, as it was known, which I think, you know, she would in any just world be called to account for. I'll be putting it just that way. The second one is about negligence. It's not really about negligence, it's about civil liability. So in the Financial Services Act 2012, it says that the FCA is exempt from civil liability. So if it's negligent and you lose money as a result, that's tough. You can't have any money back. Now, when the politicians made that law, they created effectively 3 carve-outs. The first carve-out is if you can prove that your human rights were breached, and one of your rights is the right to the quiet enjoyment of your assets, then you may be able to claim. But you've got to be able to prove that the breach of that right was because of the actions of the regulator. It's a tough call. I don't believe anybody succeeded. Again, I have to be careful what I say, but who knows which direction the Connaught case might go. Perhaps it will end up in court. Perhaps we will be alleging human rights breach. I don't know. The second one is bad faith. Bad faith basically means that they've acted almost criminally, misconduct in public office. That's even harder to prove, I would respectively suggest. The third carve-out that politicians very wisely created was, they said, look, the reason why we've created this exemption from civil liability is we don't want the FCA spending all of its time justifying itself in a courtroom and rehashing stuff that may be very confidential and sensitive. So this is why we don't want this to happen. Instead, what we've done is we've created a complaint scheme. If you think that you've been hard done by the regulator, you complain to the regulator, it may compensate you. If you don't like what the regulator says, you go to the Financial Regulators Complaints Commissioner. And they basically said that that has the right to recommend, that person can recommend whatever he or she wants. It's not binding on the regulator, but you've got to hope the regulator will do it. And if the regulator doesn't do it, you could judicially review that decision. Now, the problem is that they also allowed the FCA to set up the rules of that complaint scheme. And over the years, those rules have become more and more unfavourable to consumers. In practice, it is impossible to get material amounts of compensation out of it, and it's almost impossible to get compensation out of it where there is a suggestion that there is regulatory failure. So in practice, it's of no value at all. If you want 500 quid out of them, you might get it one day, but you won't get any more than that. And they're even trying to make the rules even worse. Over the summer, in the middle of COVID, they had a very concentrated, shorter than normal consultation period during the summer holidays about making the rules even more favourable to themselves. A load of organisations, including TTF, fought back, and as a result, the FCA has postponed its response to that consultation till the autumn, probably just until it hopes that people have forgotten about it, frankly.
Thank you very much.
Mark, your knowledge is so helpful. Let's go to Alan Salomon with a quick point, then we'll go to Anthony Stanfield with a quick point. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Alan Salomon. Had a whole career in pensions and pension investments. The last 10 to 12 years, I've been independent, sorting out problems and breaches at mainly large provider companies. And I mean, from what I've seen, there will be serious problems everywhere. The industry is so complicated that there's nobody who can get things right all the time. Even when people are trying to do their best, there'll be problems arising. Any system changes, any staff changes, any process changes, these don't go across the board ever. They're for departments or individual areas. So new things don't link up with old things. And this is across the industry. So there's massive problems, most of which we've never discovered, and they will come out, some of them bit by bit. But what I wanted to say, that was about me, what I wanted to say, the all-parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services was established in December, not long ago, I know. This consisted of some MPs in Parliament that want a debate on the FCA. The belief is it's not doing its job properly for all the reasons that have been said that Mark's gone into, which it was a great presentation. Does anybody know, Andrew, do you know what's the latest on that and what's its likely trajectory? Because that sounds like a way that we can actually get something done.
I have some information about that. There's going to be a debate in the House of Lords next week where this issue is going to be raised. I don't know how far they've got with regards to having a full parliamentary debate on it, but they're trying.
Thank you, John. And just to add to that, I'm going to share my screen. So for those of you that don't know, the Transparency Task Force is very proud to be the secretariat to two all-party parliamentary groups, one on pension scams, and the other is this one on personal banking and fairer financial services. Now, because we're the secretariat, we're obviously aware of what's going on within it, and I can share with you everything I'm about to say because it's all public knowledge. When you create an all-party parliamentary group, it must have a purpose statement. Its purpose statement is effectively its manifesto, and have a read of that. Okay, the words in there about regulation are very, very important. It says to identify aspects of personal banking and financial services where the service providers or regulators have not delivered or are not delivering excellence and appropriate consumer protection, etc. So this APBG has been created for various reasons, including trying hard to make the regulators better than they are. And I'm very, very confident that for a number of reasons, there's going to be quite a lot of activity in Parliament around the apparent shortcomings at the regulator. John, thank you for your point. That's very interesting indeed. And please do circle back to that when you're speaking later. Mr. Anthony Stansfeld, lovely to have you with us. Please do introduce yourself because a few on the call might not know who you are, and then go to your point, Anthony. Thank you.
Well, I've got a sort of a statement, but can I say I thought it was a brilliant presentation, which I totally agreed with. And I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner of Thames Valley, the police force that prosecuted the very large HBOS fraud. But fraud is a crime that's largely ignored. The sums of money lost and the damage caused is absolutely vast. The Serious Fraud Office is far too small to deal with the size of the fraud problem, and the Financial Conduct Authority fails either to investigate major fraud or protect the whistleblowers. And the National Crime Agency has yet to prosecute a single fraud. The classic case is the Lloyds internally written Turnbull report. It laid out the major fraud within HBOS and Lloyds Bank. The author was sacked without proper compensation and the report rubbished by the bank, which claimed it was neither authorised nor substantiated. It was both authorised and substantiated, as internal Lloyds emails clearly show. The FCA has failed to follow up the report, which it has sat upon for the last 6 years. The report named both the guilty people involved and the companies that were aware of the frauds at board level. The FCA totally failed to protect the author of the report, and it took myself and others to make sure that she was eventually compensated properly by Lloyds, who had to admit to the fact that her report was authorised. The NCA was asked by the Treasury Select Committee over a year ago to look into the widespread use of forged documents to bankrupt companies and individuals. It now has 21 large files covering over 500 cases in which forged documents has been used. It is still assessing the documents, and no investigation has even started after about 15 months. The underlying problem with the regulatory authorities is firstly that there are far too many of them, and there are no clear lines of responsibility. Responsibilities overlap, and many employ the very people who are in the companies involved in the frauds, as Mark brought out, but it's a point that I see time and time again. It's all too easy for the authorities to shuffle a case indefinitely between each other without any organisation taking it on. Only one major banking fraud has been brought to justice in recent years, the HBOS Reading case. Even that had been turned down by the SFA. It was not taken on by the SFA, and 2 police forces had turned it down before it was taken on by Thames Valley Police. And even then, only a small part of the case was prosecuted. Many of the guilty were not prosecuted. If TBEP had not taken on the case, no victim would have been compensated, no one held to account. It was about 850 million. Lloyds so far have paid out about 100 million. They should be paying out about 300 million, and have resisted it absolutely all the way. There now need to be clear lines of responsibility drawn between the FCA and the NCA, that's the National Crime Agency. The clue lies in the names. The FCA should only deal with misconduct. The NCA should deal with crime. It should not be too difficult to distinguish between the two. And the need for both the SFO and the FCA is questionable. The police should be held to account for not investigating frauds in their constabularies. However, they need the funding to do this. It should be self-financing, but currently fines levied revert to the Treasury. The HBOS case cost Thames Valley £7 million. Lloyds Bank were fined 60 million, reduced for inexplicable reasons to 45 million, because they certainly didn't cooperate. And the fine reverted to the Treasury. None came back to Thames Valley Police, which is hardly an incentive for police forces to take on major fraud. They simply cannot afford to do it. The current regulatory system of dealing with fraud is a shambles that allows the vast majority of major fraud to continue unchallenged. No one is held to account at a senior level. The victims are not compensated. Companies, jobs and families are destroyed. And it really mustn't be allowed to continue. Neither the FCA nor the National Crime Agency want to investigate fraud committed by banks. It's as simple as that. And that is why we have such a shambles going on at the moment. Thank you.
No, thank you, Anthony. Thank you so much. We are very grateful to your input as always, Anthony. If only everybody with your kind of role had the commitment and determination to speak truth to power and tell it as it is, as you do. It's wonderful to have you with us. We're going to be moving on very shortly, but I'm sure everybody's going to be very happy to do what I'm about to suggest, which is to show our appreciation wholeheartedly to Mark Bishop for that wonderful presentation earlier. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Very well done.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Andy, for inviting me.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome. Okay, folks, we're going to go straight to our next two speakers. It's a bit of a double act, so to speak. We've got Mark Wright and Steve Middleton. The reasons why Mark and Steve are going to be speaking will become very self-evident very quickly. Chaps, tell it as it is. Off you go. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the invite. I'm Mark Wright, and co-founder of Bank Confidential, and I am a former whistleblower of the NatWest and RBS Group. Worked there for 25 years. There are many things that I could have, being invited to Are the Regulators Fit for Purpose, there are many things that I could have come with. The fact that I disclosed to Mr. Bailey when he was the CEO of the FCA the name of the signature forgery trainer in the RBS Group, and he did nothing with that information, and it was on the front page of the Mail on Sunday a year after I actually gave him the name of the signature forgery trainer in corporate and commercial, and never even got a whistleblowing reference number. And so that's just one example. But what I really wanted to share was that when I actually whistleblow very serious deliberate market abuse within the NatWest and Royal Bank of Scotland group, I was then targeted to such a degree that eventually you have no alternative but to leave, and my health was impacted considerably. Now, what I decided to do was that when the false statement, a director called Chris Sullivan put a false statement out in September of 2008, after the RBS Group had actually had a substantial rights issue in the first quarter of 2008. There were rumours that the bank were going to be under a little bit of pressure, and suddenly appearing on the intranet, one of the directors stated, and this is what we were encouraged to relay to all staff, customers and shareholders, that the group is very well capitalised. Now, when that statement went on, to when that statement was removed, the share price plummeted by 90%. I whistleblew and said, well, how can you possibly state that the group is well capitalised when the bank is currently receiving covert loans from the Bank of England? So I continued to fly the flag for all of the shareholders that, and there are 200,000 or 300,000 RBS staff that obviously saw 90% of their life's work and savings disappear in the space of 4 months. And I raised this with the regulator. I had the full support of Sir Norman Lamb as my MP, and he's now lead patron of Bank Confidential. But I wanted to just, I haven't got quite the professional slideshow that Mark had, which is great, because I'm having to rely on emails and evidence from data subject access requests. But what I want to basically share, and hopefully this will come up, if So I raised, everyone can see this. So I raised this with Karina McTeague via Sir Norman Lamb regarding this RBS intranet statement that was basically throwing everybody, staff, customers and shareholders who were coming in and asking, you know, is everything okay? Oh yeah, we'll read this statement out. Everything is fine. We've got no issues capital wise. And as far as the FCA were concerned, and if you actually read the internal email from Karina McTeague to Sir Norman Lamb's office, it clearly states that Mr. Wright has asked about, you can all read it, which he has been unable to find because the bank refused to give me my internal emails where I cut and pasted this market abuse statement. And it's bizarre that in 2013, after the bank had been bailed out for tens of billions with one level of bank malpractice after another, that the FCA stance is that the bank have done an investigation and they can't find it, and the FCA have no reason to disbelieve them. Well, obviously, I read this statement out thousands of times and saw the catastrophe that, you know, you had 100,000 in savings on the 17th of September 08. And by the time the bank removed that statement, you'd have lost 90,000 of your funds. So therefore, you can understand that the bank wasn't very happy that I was whistleblowing over an issue like this. Still pursuing this with the Financial Conduct Authority and with Sir Norman, you know, they're trying to label me as being somebody that was mad and somebody that was, you know, oh, he's totally mistaken. So we then, Sir Norman then goes back to the Financial Conduct Authority shortly after in 2014, which you will see on the next one here, and he gets a letter back. And I have snipped the letter down because obviously it was quite a long letter, but point 3, and this is the 11th of April 2014, Director of Retail Banking and Supervision, Karina McTeague, is stating to Sir Norman Lamb, at this point in time, there's nothing further we can add in relation to your allegations about a 2008 internal message published on the RBS intranet site being misleading at all. So again, I'm still at a loss there, knowing I had so many staff come forward, reporting to the Serious Fraud Office, and the Serious Fraud Office is stating to RBS staff, my colleagues, we don't want any more staff coming through backing up what Mr. Wright has stated. So we carry on pursuing things, and this is where I had considerable help from Steve Middleton, who is the chief advisor at Bank Confidential, and we then decided to raise a complaint regarding the FCA's handling of everything. Because what I haven't told you is that in my early days of whistleblowing to the Financial Conduct Authority, to the executives there, we found internal emails that, well, as soon as I was going to the FCA executives, they were going straight back to the RBS executive office, disclosing that we have Mark Wright here, one of your members of staff, and he's saying this, and this. So again, this was the stance from the FCA that there was nothing at all. So I raised a, Steve Middleton, who will be on next, raised a complaint with the Complaints Commissioner, the Regulators regulator, about them, the FCA disclosing my name back to RBS as a whistleblower, to which they had to make an apology. I then decided to do a data subject access request on the Complaints Commissioner. I'd already done one on the FCA, but what I received from the FCA was rather sketchy, and it was clearly the documentation they had gone through with a fine-tooth comb so that nothing slipped. Receiving the data subject access request from the Complaints Commissioner, I wanted to share with you the following, and the following are internal emails between the FCA executives at Supervision and Enforcement, and these are the emails that they found. So bearing in mind, in the 11th of April 2014, Karina McTeague is writing to Sir Norman, there's nothing further to report, nothing there, Gov. and an internal email on the 12th of March, and it's a redacted a bit because it's obviously from the FCA to the Complaints Commissioner. I received a call from about Mr. Wright, which evidences that the intranet notice that Mr. Wright refers to was online between the 17th of September 2008 and January 2009, which would support Mr. Wright's allegations. There's a further email, internal email on the FCA servers. All evidence that the intranet notice that Mr. Wright refers to was online between the 17th of September 2008 to January 2009. The staff could have used it to take reassurances that all was well, which would tend to support Mr. Wright's allegations. So we go from the FCA. My view is that the FCA are just as dangerous currently in the current format as the banks, because they will literally cover up the malpractices, as you can see here in black and white. And it incensed Sir Norman Lamb so much that he obviously mentioned in a debate in Parliament, to which the FCA come back and said, "No, Sir Norman, you're not understanding us. You got things wrong." So Sir Norman wanted and basically was demanding an apology from Andrew Bailey for alleged defamation. So in a nutshell, this statement is of such significance. We have a group counsel at RBS stating to Sir Norman that this statement cannot go into the public domain because it'd be far too damaging. Well, yeah, sure it would. There'd be far too many shareholders that would be in a position that would be able to be put back to where they were prior to losing 90% and more of their holding. And this, like I say, it just shows the level of dishonesty and the fact that you have a regulator that doesn't regulate. And to see that, you know, that the collusion and the cover up on this particular scenario is quite staggering. But it's not all lost, because a couple of weeks ago, I filed and served a judicial review against the Complaints Commissioner for failing to do his job. And that was, he had stated that he had seen a statement, but he didn't know if he had the whole statement. And then the FCA stated, well, Andrew Bailey stated that it had been discussed at the Treasury Select Committee when the bank collapsed. We'd done a Freedom of Information request on the TSC, and they had never seen this statement that Mr. Bailey stated was in the public domain for 10 years. So it's been literally been one, and every time the FCA have always changed their story as they go. So as far as everything goes as we see at the moment, I'm waiting on this judicial review. If there's anybody on the call who could provide some assistance or know some lawyers with expertise in judicial reviews that would be prepared to work on a pro bono basis, as Bank Confidential is a community interest company and not for profit, and hopefully we'll be able to get the answers and get real redress to all those shareholders that were thrown under a bus. But apologies if I've just overrun somewhat, but it just goes, and I just wanted to demonstrate the scale of the cover-up and the fact that the FCA are as bad as the bank on this occasion.
Mark, thank you so much for your presentation. A couple of immediate points come to mind. I have no idea whether Ian Mitchell QC would or wouldn't be happy to liaise with you on a pro bono basis, but I do know that Ian Mitchell QC has been wonderfully helpful in relation to a range of matters and has become a tremendous friend and ally to the TTF. So what I would invite my colleague Alexandra to do is to connect you, Mark, with Ian Mitchell QC. I'm confident that at very worst, Ian Mitchell QC would be happy to have a conversation with you and might be able to in some way give you some useful information. Of course, Ian Mitchell QC, if you don't want that to happen, just liaise and let us know, and we won't do it. That's
I'd be very happy to have a preliminary chat and see if anything might be done. But judicial reviews are extraordinarily risky without any kind of funding, but we can discuss all that.
Thank you so much. Any assistance or guidance would be greatly appreciated. Can't thank you enough.
Thank you, Mark. And also there's a note in the chat from Steve Farrell. Steve Farrell says, Mark Wright, get in contact with Gary Heath. Alexandra, can you please connect Gary Heath with Mark Wright by email and let that conversation happen? Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you.
Helen has put her hand up. Lovely to see you, Helen. We're going to go to Helen and we're going to go swiftly to Steve Middleton. Helen, to you. Thank you.
Yes, no, I was just going to say last week, you probably heard in the news, review against the FSCS. This was raised by the LCF credit committee. That was actually done on a pro bono basis. So I was just, I'm not sure they would be happy to do another one, but I'm just saying it can be done, and it was done. Just the other point I'd like to make is about cover up and complicity, really. At the last meeting I did a presentation on the LCF failures, regulatory failures, and also I mentioned the ready to invest regulatory failures. Clearly in the LCF case there was complicity. In fact, the FCA actually supported this Ponzi scheme by actually granting full FCA authorization when they'd been warned back in November 2015. They granted authorization June 2016, and of course this was a catalyst for huge increase in bondholder volumes, and bondholders only really invested because LCF was regulated. That gave them some comfort that the investment was safe and they would have financial redress. In the case of the R2I, there are huge similarities with the LCF case, but it is a shocking scandal. It has not been investigated properly. We have been in touch with Anthony Stanto, who's been incredibly helpful on this matter. But this was a huge cover-up between the Jersey Financial Services Commission and the FCA, whereby they knew about a serious misconduct and fraud operated by this company, Ready to Invest. They did not report it. They did nothing about it. They knew about it in 2007. And one of the banks, the Ready to Invest bankers, knew about the fraudulent activities as well. And yet the bank then opened up bank accounts so this company could then market an unlawful, fraudulent Ponzi scheme in 2008. And obviously the FCA knew about it. They did absolutely nothing. They didn't report it to anyone. So, they really were, again, complicit and supported this crime, as did the bank.
Helen, thank you for squeezing so much in so quickly.
It's all right.
The passion with which you deliver your point, the amount of frustration and angst and annoyance that your life experience has led you to feel. Thank you for making that point so powerfully, Helen. So we've just had a very powerful presentation from Mark Wright, which followed a very, very powerful presentation by Anthony Stansfeld, which followed a very, very, very powerful presentation from Mark Bishop. And now it's Steve Middleton's turn to tell us some stuff that's going to curl our toes as well. Steve, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I've got 30 years now experience in financial services, investment advisor, banking in the background. And I was working as an IFA back in 2013 when one of my customers came along to me and asked me to look at this swap product he'd bought, this interest rate swap, that he'd been told would protect him from increasing interest rates, which I think many people are aware of these products and the fact there was a review a few years ago on this. And what I'm really asking is, are the FCA truly independent and are they really able to make their own decisions when it comes to how they deal with the banks and their reviews, and certainly certain banks? We had a story go out with the Independent a few months ago now. It was about a doctor's practice who had been sold one of these swaps over it was a 25-year period swap, which they were told would protect them from increasing interest rates. And effectively they bought a fixed rate of 5.2% literally in August 2008, just before Lehman's went under. And it was forward sold. So effectively by the time the swap had actually started in 2009, they had a substantial liability to pay over and above the normal variable rate. Now, what they didn't know at the time was that in the background, the bank not only expected to lose them substantial amounts of money on the swap deal, because effectively it's just a long-term investment contract betting against the bank on interest rates. They actually lent the GPs the money for this investment without telling them, by putting credit in place in the background, having that credit approved. And that credit, because there wasn't security in the GP's practice, was completely reliant upon the doctor's own assets, their own homes and funds. Now, the level of that credit risk was on top of a 5.2 million loan. Hopefully you'll see here was a further limit of 3.647 million. So in other words, almost 3.7 million additional lending to cover this swap credit limit. Now, where I've had numerous debates with banks and lawyers and the regulator, the banks, and particularly RBS, who are the bank involved here, have long tried to make out these credit facilities applied for with swaps are simply contingent facilities, and you don't need to worry about them. If you don't break the swap, it's irrelevant. But you will see here, if you look at the chart in front of me, that there is an existing limit on the left-hand side, and you'll see there's a loan of 5.288 million. The existing swap limit is 3.647 million. The total direct exposure for the connection is 8.9 million. So in other words, these doctors borrowed 5.2 million. It was a 100% loan to value deal, which the bank would do on GP practices. So they had a 5.2 million pound building with a 5.2 million debt. Over and above that, they had a further 3.7 million liability that no one told them about. Now, the effect of this was that on their credit files, the risk was so high and so unfair and unrealistic that had been sold to them. On the credit files, continually, the bank were saying that in the event of any type of default, they would have to resort to the doctor's own funds and assets to recover the additional liabilities. The doctor's own funds and assets would not have covered these liabilities. So effectively, any failure to make a payment on this swap contract would within a week have brought about the bank going after all of the doctors and taking them into bankruptcy or insolvency. Now, sorry, just going back to that chart. What I raised with the FCA, and this is the issue I'm really bringing today, is that the doctor's practice went into the independent review, in theory independent review, where KPMG were independent reviewers, in theory looking at all of these sales and seeing whether or not they were acceptable and whether they complied with the rules. Now, just before the doctors went into the financial review, there was a credit application made internally at the bank that reduced this 3.7 million liability down to 1.44 million. Now, that is a massive change in the interest rate risk. You'd have had to have seismic events happening globally to bring about that type of change. But what it did effectively was hide the substantial amount of credit risk before this went to the independent reviewer. So it brought the credit risk down from 3.7 million, this was in September 2013, to 1.44. This then allowed the bank manager to submit a file note to the review, an independent reviewer, where he suggested the contingent liability, which relates to this credit risk, is only 1.44 million. Now, that should still have been added to the loan to value on this case, which would have meant that at the outset, even when the product was sold, that the liability was 1.9 million, but at the outset of this loan and swap, the actual loan to value risk for those doctors was 176%. Now, within the review, that alone, that issue should have led to a tear up of this product, which would have meant full compensation for the doctors. However, in the review, they actually didn't get offered any compensation at all. And if you look at the next slide here, what you'll see is that shortly after the file has gone into the review, there's a further credit application where the swap credit facility goes back to 3.5 million. So I took this to the FCA and I alleged that one, within the review, contingent liabilities or this credit risk was being ignored, even though it was a key rule in the FCA's handbook that it had to be considered, and two, that the files had been rigged. And what I took to them was a quote I had from 2016, where I debated this contingent liability or credit risk with David D'Souza at the FCA. And I suggested the banks were not considering this credit risk in breach of the rules. And you can see what he said to me there was that contingent liabilities, as he rightly says, relates to potential future liabilities a customer might face in the event of reductions in interest rates. Where he's slightly wrong there is with RBS, those liabilities are hardcore liabilities at the outset and remain so right throughout the term of the swap. But what he does say is the IRHP review does of course consider whether the bank sufficiently explains to the customer the risks of these contingent liabilities. So again, I took this case to the FCA executives who said they were very interested in it, wanted to see the evidence. So I suggested, look, the RBS have rigged the files, they've ignored the rules in the review, they haven't complied with the rules, and yet they'd actually provided a written undertaking to the FCA that they will comply with all of the rules in the review process. We actually got the internal KPMG files on this review process, and what KPMG said as compared to the FCA is they did agree, as you can see, that there was no evidence that contingent liability was discussed with the customer prior to the trade. That should have led, in theory, to, again, a tear-up of the product. But what they then say is the setting and monitoring of the contingent liability is not, however, covered in the IRHP review, which is the direct opposite what David D'Souza, the technical head of the review, had told me back in 2016. And they go on to say that the setting of any contingent liability is a credit risk function carried out as part of the operational process. It is not related to the sales standards agreed with the FCA. So effectively, KPMG are suggesting that the FCA were not interested in them considering this credit risk, even though the FCA technical specialists were insisting that it was being looked at. So getting the executives involved, I assumed they would have been shocked by what I was showing them, and that these people had gone through the review process and should have received circa £5 million in compensation. They actually were offered nothing. And you can see from the first response I got that Toby Hall, a private secretary to Andrew Bailey, they're looking at the issue, they've contacted KPMG, they've contacted RBS. There could be no logical explanation for this change on the credit file other than trying to rig the file for a review process. And the FCA even tried to block the surgeries. Unfortunately, the GPs were in such a dire situation with the costs of the swap. They were in the process of then selling their surgery to a third party. And the FCA executive even asked us to try and block that sale while they resolve the issue. And unfortunately, we couldn't do it because there were some doctors wanting to retire and they simply couldn't risk losing the deal. They had to let the sale go through. At the end of December, however, after spending several months looking into this, the formal response from the FCA to me was, this is not a matter where the FCA will intervene further. So I've given the FCA evidence that the RBS had breached their undertakings on the review, that files have been rigged in the review, that the breach of rules should have led directly to £5 million compensation, but it led to nothing. And the FCA's response ultimately was they did nothing. And why did they do nothing? Well, these are my concerns. The position was quite clear. There should have been a tear-up under the rules of the review and under the FCA's own rules. However, this was one practice. There were estimated to be around 4,000 firms in the review process from the medical and healthcare sector. So if just in 10% of those cases, if you had similar risks and liabilities, and the bank had done the same file rigging to try and reduce or not pay out compensation, you could be looking at a liability at RBS of £2 billion, possibly more. And a lot of that money would have been NHS subsidised monies. And my view is quite simply, and I allege this to the FCA, that the FCA are not in control of these matters. I believe they instructed RBS to consider compensation. However, I think either HM Treasury or RBS refused, simply citing the costs that would be incurred should they do so. And I think that's the problem. We have too much correlation between Parliament, the government, the Treasury and the regulator. And until we break that down and have an independent regulator, not based on the FCA, I don't think anything will change.
Steve, thank you very much indeed for presenting yet another powerful set of evidence. Really, really powerful. And it's great that you've taken time to prepare the document you just presented to us. Thank you for doing that. Folks, we're going to be finishing the formal part of tonight's session at roughly 1/4 the hour, but we will keep the channel open until 1/2 the hour. That's 8:30 UK time. Because inevitably there's going to be lots of people who want to carry on talking. I do need to manage time quite tightly, so we're not going to go to Q&A or comment response in relation to what Steve has just talked about or what Mark Wright spoke about earlier, but we will come back to a Q&A session later. In the meantime, can I invite everybody please to show their appreciation to Mark Wright and of course to Steve Middleton as well. Thank you very much indeed. Very, very good. Thank you very, very much indeed. And I promise, guys, we will get back to Q&A time shortly. What I'm going to do now, though, is deal with three very, very important points. So please tune into what I'm about to say. I need to say it quite succinctly and clearly because I haven't got time to repeat it. There are three opportunities to do some useful stuff. Okay. Opportunity one relates to two initiatives that the Transparency Task Force is driving forward with in relation to whistleblowing. One is an idea of a whistleblower trophy. We believe that whistleblowers are a profoundly important part of the system. Not only should they be protected properly by regulators et al., they should also be acknowledged for the wonderful job they do in helping society. These are people who often take risk in doing what they do and very often suffer as a consequence. So we want to do our little bit to acknowledge the work that whistleblowers do on behalf of society, and they often get a lot of grief as a result of it. The second thing we are going to be doing with whistleblowers is we are going to be carrying out a survey that will gather in a reasonably academically robust manner experiences of whistleblowers in relation to their interaction with regulators. Okay, so if you have ever been involved with anything to do with whistleblowing and you are happy to be involved with this initiative, in other words, you want more information, just put the word whistleblower into the chat and we'll make sure that we follow up. So put whistleblower in the chat if you want to know more about what I've just said. The second thing, thanks John Banerjee, that was pretty damn quick. Thank you, Paul Carter, that was pretty damn quick too. Oh, good Lord, and Joanne and Mark Wright, fantastic. This is exactly what we need to do, folks. We need to work together, gather our intelligence, develop strategies and implement. This is exactly what we need to do, folks. The second thing we need your help with, folks, is the two regulatory consultations that are already underway. They're basically all about what needs to be done to make the regulatory system work better. The brilliant news is that Mark Bishop has already done some superb heavy lifting on this. The documents already are shaping into a really powerful consultation, but we want other people to be involved. We developed what we call a response squad. It's where people work collaboratively within the TTF community to actually produce a consultation response. So if you're happy to be involved with that, and it doesn't take a lot of time, it really doesn't take a lot of time, just put the word consultation into chat and we'll make sure that we include you in the activity around that. Apart from anything else, it will be a great chance for you to make sure that your thoughts get fed into the consultation. TTF, in my opinion, is a wonderfully collaborative environment, and we work so hard to be a truly kind of democratically structured organization, and this is how we do it. Thank you all very much indeed for those of you that have just responded to that, including Dr. Shan Turnbull, quite literally one of the world's best governance experts, all the way in Australia. He's here with us tonight, even though it's obviously very early doors in Australia right now. The third key word is evidence. I'm pleased to tell everybody that the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services tasked me and the Secretariat, which is all made up of TTF members, to go out there and gather evidence about people's interactions with the regulators. Put the word evidence into the chat if you think you may have some evidence that could be useful to the all-party parliamentary group, because they want to gather evidence about people's experience when interacting with the regulators. Evidence is the word you need to put into that. Thank you all for dealing with those few minutes so efficiently for me. We'll follow up, just put the words in, either put the word whistleblower in there or consultation in there or evidence, and off we go. What we're going to do now, folks, is go straight to John Banerjee. I'm pretty confident that what you're going to hear from John is going to be in keeping with the kind of messages we've been hearing from Mark Wright, Steve Middleton, Anthony Stansfeld, and Mark Bishop as well. Mr. John Banerjee, I'm very, very grateful to you for sharing that which you're about to share. Thank you very much, John. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I'll be as brief as I can because I realise that we're under serious time constraints. But I want to share with you this evening some experiences of whistleblowing and actually supposedly succeeding within the system. And I'd like to throw some light, obviously, on the matter of whether the FCA is fit for purpose. Mr. Outgoing former Governor Mark Carney, in the Christmas wreath memorial lecture, stated that the major policy innovation and learning point from the global financial crisis was to put personal accountability at the heart of this financial system, and particularly the regulatory regime. In practical terms, that was to enact legislation whereby senior managers would be responsible not only for their direct actions, but also for the foreseeable consequences of their minions and their minions' actions. This resulted in the senior manager and certification regime, which finally came into force in March 2016. So it took a full 8 years after the global financial crisis. This wasn't a knee-jerk reaction, clearly. It was at the regulators' usual glacial pace, but it can't be argued that they hadn't thought it through. Now, the SMCR has brought very, very senior consequences to financial misconduct, serious financial misconduct. Previously, if you're engaged in serious financial misconduct, you could expect to lose your job and your career. But now, under the SMCR, on top of that, you could also be subject to a bonus clawback for up to 7 years. This was a material increase in the tariffs for serious misconduct. Originally, only large financial institutions, mostly international banks, were covered by the SMCR. This has now been widened to take in senior managers, designated senior managers, in all authorized financial companies. It is a powerful piece of legislation. However, there had, since March 2016, when it came into being, there have been 0 enforcements of the SMCR. Now, that's, some people think of 0 as being a nothing. I actually think it's an extremely informationally laden number. The FCA press department has untruthfully described Jez Staley, the Barclays CEO, as having been subject to an SMCR enforcement. But Mark Stewart, the head of the enforcement division, has personally confirmed to me that Jez Staley wasn't disciplined under the SMCR, it was under the existing COCON rules. And this is also clear from the enforcement notice against Mr. Staley. I just need to make that clear. Now, a hypothesis explaining why there have been 0 enforcements under the SMCR could be that serious financial crime in the UK has collapsed to 0 since the SMCR has been incepted. In that case, absolutely all members of society are better off. The alternative hypothesis, however, is that previously, as there were very serious consequences for wrongdoing, but the probability of being held to account was considered to be extremely low, whereas now we have a situation where the tariff for wrongdoing is even worse, much higher, materially higher, but everyone knows that the probability of being held to account almost, we're just a month and a half away from being 5 years after this legislation has come in. 0 enforcements means you know with certainty that you're not going to be dealt with if you, under this legislation, if you engage in serious wrongdoing. And of course, you know, any number multiplied by 0, you don't have to be a genius to know it's 0. Now, there's extensive empirical evidence in other regimes about what happens when the tariff goes up. For instance, there's no jurisdiction ever where at any time when the tariff for murder has increased from a term of imprisonment to capital punishment, where the murder rate has dropped to 0. Now, I would say that the alternate hypothesis that actually we're all much worse off because the senior managers regime is not being enforced is actually true. The reason why I say that, partly because of evidence of murder rates in other jurisdictions at times, but mostly because whistleblowers have told me about very serious financial misconduct occurring since the SMCR has happened, which they've reported to the FCA, and the FCA are fully aware, and yet we see no convictions. Now, I would say that we're all much worse off as a result of the introduction of the SMCR and there being no enforcement. I'm not going to go into detail about my own whistleblowing. I just want to speak at a much higher level about the fitness for purpose of the FCA. And Mark Stewart himself, the head of enforcement, he's been in place for a little over 5 years now. And he's been on the record to say, I would like to be judged on my record. In March 2019, he was quoted as saying that it's time to enliven the jurisdiction. He was talking in relation to the FCA's powers of criminal prosecution regarding money laundering. Now, it was very, very clear from his speech that if there were no prosecutions, then the credibility of the regulatory regime was at risk. Since that time, Freedom of Information Act requests have shown that the FCA's numbers of investigations into money laundering have dramatically dropped. They were a little under 200 at the time of his speech in 2019. In 2020, they fell from 75 to the low teens. And as at the end of 2020, the number of criminal enforcements that the FCA engaged in fell to a new low of 0, exactly the same as their senior managers regime. So what I'm saying in conclusion is that given the lack of FCA enforcement of the existing rules, and many people, when they see the myriad of problems that are caused by the regulatory regime that we're in, advocate new powers, new rules, more resources, and so on, I say that the lack of enforcement of the existing rules actually makes things much worse than the FCA being not fit for purpose. It actually makes the entire system much worse. It encourages more wrongdoing. And for that reason, I say that the FCA is very much part of the problem, not the solution. And I think I'm now just inside my time. So thank you.
John, that was an incredibly powerful presentation. It really was. I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years or so, and I'm still being shocked by what people are explaining. The insights you all have individually is so powerful. We just need to find ways of actually aggregating it all to a body of evidence that simply cannot be ignored. And believe you me, TTF and our many volunteers are working hard to do exactly that. John, that was a very, very, very powerful presentation. Thank you very, very much indeed. Because of where we are time-wise, we're not going to go to Q&A. We're going to kind of save all the discussion bit to the end. But before we go to the first of our Just a Minute round speakers, which is Ian Ashley, let's show our appreciation to John for his presentation just now. Thank you very much indeed, John. Thank you very, very much indeed. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to spend the next roughly 10 minutes or so going through several individuals, what we call Just a Minute round. If you're familiar with the BBC Radio 4 programme, Just a Minute, you'll understand what this is about. Each speaker literally has 1 minute, no more than that, to share the essence of what they really want to say. Unlike the Radio 4 programme, you're not allowed to repeat yourself or deviate or hesitate. You're allowed to do all 3 of those, but what you're not allowed to do is go past the 1 minute. The order is going to be as follows: Ian Ashley, followed by Ian Neal, followed by Nigel Bradshaw, followed by Georgina Halford Hall, followed by Nigel Harper, followed by Piotr Konwicki, and then Mr. John Dashfield. Now, John's going to be coming at things from a completely different perspective. I think you'll love what John's going to say, but brace yourselves for a completely different perspective from Mr. John Dashfield. I've just put the order into the chat, and then let's go straight to Mr. Ian Ashley. Great to have you with us, Ian. Over to you, sir, for your just a minute round. Thank you.
Okay. I'm probably unique in around this virtual table. I have worked for the regulator, and I am currently an SMF. So I am under the senior manager's regime. I was a junior supervisor within the regulator 15 odd years ago. And one of the things that struck me is, from what I've heard this evening, there's been no change. One of my colleagues, another relatively junior supervisor, said to me as I joined, if the FSA as it was then put itself into enforcement, it would, if the FSA as it was then did a visit on itself, it would put itself into enforcement, which I thought was a pretty damning thing for someone to say to a relatively new recruit. And I was brought in because I did have a whole raft of industry experience, and that's what I was told that the regulator wanted, and they spent 2.5 years trying to turn me into a career regulator like my colleagues. But if you look at everything that's been said this evening, the regulator is asleep at the wheel. If you look at Arch Crew, where they pointed the finger at the advisory firms rather than the creators of the product, if you look at London Capital, look at Connaught, look at the whole thing, have they really? They are part of the problem. They are actively causing harm to the industry and to consumers when they are supposed to be doing the opposite. And I would suggest that Andrew Bailey was completely the wrong choice for chief executive, because as a career banker, he has no concept of the advisory community and how to. I mean, there are advisory firms that are bad apples, but there are a lot that are very good, and he had no concept of how to regulate the vast array of diverse businesses that we all interact with on a daily basis. So I can only echo what's been said, is that, you know, how do we work with yeah, thank you, Steve. I meant career regulator, not career banker. How do we work with, is it the Treasury, is it Parliament? Who do we work with to actually change the regulator? Because it's not going to change from the inside. It's going to be, it needs something to actually put a bomb under it.
Thank you. I'm going to halt it there, Ian. I think that was just about exactly 1 minute. Perfect.
Oh,
thank you. And in keeping with your idea of it needs something else, there's some tremendous thinking being developed in Australia right now as a consequence of the Australian Royal Commission that's being championed by various people, including Dr. Andy Schmulo, who I'm very proud to say has become a volunteer member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. Essentially, the idea is a formal regulator of the regulators to create the accountability and the transparency that is needed. That may well be the kind of thing that you're searching for, Mr. Ian Ashley. We're going to go straight to Nigel Bradshaw, because I think Ian Neil's had to leave. Mr. Nigel Bradshaw, please start your just a minute round. Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you.
Good morning or good evening, all. It's good to be with you. So, for me, you know, there's so many things that could be said, but really it comes down to, in Australia, we're probably not quite as sophisticated in our level of capture and fraud that's going on in the UK, but certainly there are signs of things like this. And so everything from, you know, graduates from university not being able to get a job in a bank, well, they go work for the regulator instead. But then, of course, the career path, similar to what it sounds like in the UK for a regulator, is to be friendly to the banks and then to go and work for a bank after they've done a little bit of time, or vice versa. So fully agree that the revolving door, you know, needs to be addressed. We also have the issue here now, and in one way you could say that's good, it's been made transparent, is that in response to the pandemic, we have this concept of Team Australia, which is where essentially the independence of the Reserve Bank, the central bank, has been undermined because the governor is working together with the Treasury and with the regulators to, let's say, continue to prop up the system, rather than functioning in their role of actually, ensuring system stability and ensuring that the banking system is regulated in the appropriate manner. That's probably close to a minute, so I better stop there.
Thank you, Nigel. That's great input. Nigel, what time is it where you are right now?
Just somewhere between, there you go, 6:45 a.m. So.
We are extremely grateful to you, Nigel, for coming up with that input at this time of day for you. Superb
My
stuff.
pleasure.
And by the way, as I'm sure you know, the gentleman that just puts the comment in about Australians is an Australian, so don't come shouting at me. We'll go straight from Nigel Bradshaw to Georgina Halford Hall. Georgina, looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. For those of you who know me in the whistleblowing community in this call, you'll know that my computer is apt to giving up the ghost after a while. So I really rely on you to give me some timing, because I've messed up my phone timer as well now. But thank you, everybody. I've really enjoyed tonight's conversations. It's refreshing to see so many people who are aligned in their thinking and commitment to making changes. Now, you may have noticed I was late, and I apologise unreservedly for that, but I was detained by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Whistleblowing, for which I run the Secretariat, on a really important meeting, because we've come to an initial hiatus where we now have the first draft of a new bill called the Office of the Whistleblower. And it will completely reform the way that everyone is treated. We're not just talking about workers anymore, we're talking about all citizens and across every sector. But that's particularly relevant to this evening's conversations, given that I know Joanne and I know John and I know so many other people on this call and the issues they've had to contend with and are still contending with now. But the good part about this new bill that we've put together is it's actually going to set the standards for the regulators. It is the regulator of the regulators. So Nigel, perhaps we can touch base after this. It's going to be there to monitor and evaluate their performance. It's going to be there to order investigations where regulators seem to have misunderstood their job. It's going to protect whistleblowers, and it's also going to have that really big one in there, which is about fines and penalties, which extend to when people stand by and do nothing when they can see things happening. This is going to hugely improve the way that whistleblowing disclosures are dealt with within our system at the moment. Now, I'm going to turn very quickly to the question, mindful of time, are regulators fit for purpose? My conclusion in that is, at the moment, and I have met with more than 20 in the last nearly 6 months, is no, they're not. Well, they could be, actually. I'll take that back. They could be. If their job is to protect the people they regulate, they're doing a great job. But in terms of actually the culture that Anthony Stansfield so eloquently set out this evening, the HBOS scandal and the experience of John and Paul Collier and so on demonstrates that the regulators have failed to recognise the value of the people who are bringing vital intelligence that sets out crimes to them. Now, I probably am about at a minute now, so I'm going to stop and hope you'll invite me back to talk to you again properly. But Andy, thank you very much indeed, and thank you everyone for putting up with my minute.
Georgina, we would love to have you back with a full proper speaking slot at the next available opportunity. That would be great. The work that you and your associates do is wonderful, and it's great to hear the developments you've just described in relation to the work of the APPAG as well. I'm so pleased that you're involved in what we're trying to do, and that we are in turn involved in what you're trying to do as well. Superb stuff, Georgina. Thank you very much. We're now going to go to, I think it's Nigel Harper next. Bear with me, I've lost my list. Yes, it is Mr. Nigel Harper. Nigel's not known for beating about the bush, so this could be interesting. Nigel, go for it, sir.
Well, I agree with most of everything that has been said tonight, and I must say that last bit of news that I heard for the last speaker, Georgina, was superb, and actually very, very welcome. What I want to talk about is the thing I've been banging on since 2015, bearing in mind I've been in banking 50 years. I joined in 1971.
Nigel, forgive me interrupting you. We can't see your face. It's a beautiful face and everyone's missing out. So can you do something to adjust your device so that we can see your face, please, sir? Thank you very much.
Is that better?
Perfect. Absolutely
Good,
perfect.
good.
Thank you very much.
Right. What I'm putting forward are two simple structures, and the simplicity is the important factor. At the moment, well, when I joined banking, chairmen and boards have full responsibility for whether the banks survived or died. Now, we don't have that anymore. And unfortunately, I think we ought to get back to it. And by that, what I'm recommending is that the controller for banking has a fraud and police department, an enforcement department, an internal audit department, and it looks at lending, operations, authorizations, risk and liquidity. Now, the most important facet of all this is chairman and board's accountability. They are accountable for who they employ to act on their behalf. They are accountable for the lawyers, accountants, insolvency practitioners, fraud departments, and various other people. You know, they don't show any effort in being accountable. And this is what we have to bring back. The SMCR is just a lawyer fest. It is designed to forestall any form of litigation against an employee because, of course, damages and fines that they will ultimately pay or not pay, as the case is probably going to be, will never be levied. So we've got a problem here. The problem is we need the controller for banking and the professional complaints regulator to be remote from Treasury and government. And I like the idea of a regulator of regulators, because I think they would slide in there under that office exceptionally well. But we do need to be totally remote. We need bankers back in charge of banking. The lawyers and accountants have had a field day for too long, and I really despair when I see my banking profession being destroyed.
Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. We're listening to and hearing such powerful testimony from many, many people tonight. I don't pretend to know Nigel very well, but I do know this. He really means everything he says. He really feels everything he says. Nigel's a guy who can remember back when things were done completely differently, when the banking sector was known to be a place of great professionalism and great ethics, where my word is my bond. And you can feel when you hear Nigel talk, the heartache in his soul about what's happened to the banking sector in recent decades. We're going to go straight to Piotr. Piotr, thank you for being with us, sir. Please share us your key points in the next minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, for having me here. Just to link with absolutely excellent Mark's first presentation, and I think the good old-fashioned idea of a stick and a carrot. I mean, I completely agree that in order to move forward, we need to fully assess what went wrong and what has been going wrong with the regulator. And from this point of view, Mark's analysis and all other comments, in my opinion, were spot on. But I also agree that, well, how can we change this? I think we need to offer some kind of a carrot to them so that they want to talk to us. They want to change. And I would like to touch base with what he said about upscaling folks who need to be promoted, upskilling them, excuse me. And then sort of if we can propose a set of seminars for the regulators, in which we will not only share our experiences, but we will also indicate what sort of skills will be needed, will be required from the new breed of regulators. And this is especially important in terms of that, well, I wouldn't be surprised that very soon we'll see another scam of Bitcoin-related fund or something like that, where many of the regulators, they do not have enough technical skills. Not only the feeling for the for needs to be done, because I completely agree. The role of the regulator is to protect the consumer, not to develop financial services. However, if we showed at least we can then say safely that we are here not only to criticize what went wrong, but also to come up with something very positive, something very tangible, which they can use at the almost immediately. Just a food for thought.
Thank you very much, Piotr. Great points. Great points. Our final just a minute round is from Mr. John Dashfield, who, by the way, I'm extremely grateful to. John provides TTF on a completely pro bono basis with some very valuable coaching, support, guidance, leadership. And John's got great thoughts and ideas. As I mentioned earlier, John's going to come at this from a completely different perspective. Please do absorb what John's about to say. I think it's a very important additional perspective to everything else that has been discussed tonight. And in my opinion, it really, really does get perhaps to the heart of the matter. John Dashfield, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and great to be here with everyone. Fantastic speakers. So, as Andy said, I just get my minute across as concisely as I can. But the angle I want to come from is to realise that all the problems that are being discussed tonight are a product of human thought and a human state of mind. And I noticed a comment from Steve Farrell on the chat box earlier, where he said we're talking about symptoms and really not the disease. And really that's the nub of it. Willful, intentional lack of transparency and criminal activity and all the things that we're talking about is a direct result of people who feel insecure. Now, everything that I've been hearing and how it looks to me is the regulator is pretty much as insecure as the people it's trying to regulate, which is what we're hearing about all of these stories. Now, where I would come from is to say, if you keep treating the symptoms, you'll never cure the disease. And the symptom is a state of mind problem. So my company has been dealing with this for 15 years in financial services on a relatively small scale, and it's very successful. So the technology is there to deal with this. And I'd love to have that conversation on a much bigger scale with people, because just to finish off my point, someone I know runs a company or an organisation, a non-profit actually, called One Solution Global, where they tackle really big problems in humanity. And Mara Gleason, she said, if you don't change the minds of people, you're not going to see any change in the world. So that is where the problem is. It's a fundamental state of mind problem. And until we solve that, we'll be in the same place in 10, 20, 30 or 40 years. We'll just be the same things repeated over and over and over. So anyway, that was my minute. Thank you for the platform.
Wonderful, wonderful. So much great content tonight. I'll briefly mention in passing that on Monday evening, we have our second film club event. We're looking at a film called The Gates, The Barbarians at the Gate, a really interesting film about financial services conduct. And then on Thursday next week, we have the session by Larry Elford, who's with us tonight, about Larry's book. So be aware there's a couple of things you can check in with next week. It's now 8 o'clock. We're going to finish the formal sort of session now. We've miraculously ended up finishing pretty much bang on time, but I am going to keep the channel open for any further loosely facilitated conversation. So I think what we should do first of all is please once again put your hands together to show our appreciation for the input to tonight's session. Some of the preparation, in fact all of the preparation, has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.